It was a frosty morning, the kind where the world feels quiet, wrapped in a soft blanket of snow. Somewhere on the outskirts of a small, sleepy village, a farmer was making his way through the forest, his boots crunching against the ice-crusted ground. He didn't know it yet, but what he would stumble upon that day would change not only his life, but also the life of an abandoned little lynx cub, fighting against the odds to survive. The air was cold enough to bite, and the forest seemed still, almost lifeless. But as the farmer stopped to rest, he heard it, a faint, almost desperate sound. A cry, too soft to be human, but filled with the kind of longing that made him pause. He glanced around, his heart quickening. Could it be an injured animal? A fox? Or worse, a predator that might be lurking close by? He followed the sound, each step taking him further into the woods, and then he saw it. A tiny ball of fur curled up against the base of a tree. It was trembling, its thin coat no match for the harsh winter. It wasn't hard to tell. This little creature was in trouble. Alone, abandoned and weak, the lynx cub didn't have long. But what could he do? He was just a farmer, not a wildlife expert. Yet something about those wide, frightened eyes wouldn't let him walk away. This is the story of that unlikely encounter, a moment when a man and a wild animal crossed paths, forging a bond that would test their limits and change their lives forever. It's a story of survival, trust, and the incredible connections that can form in the most unexpected ways. The forest was eerily silent that morning, except for the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional gust of wind. The farmer, an older man with a weathered face and callous hands, had been out early to collect firewood. The forest was his backyard, familiar in every sense, but today it felt different. Something unseen was pulling him deeper into the woods, beyond his usual path. The cry reached his ears again, softer this time, as if whatever was making the sound had almost given up. He turned toward it, scanning the dense underbrush. At first, he thought it might be a bird, but the sound was too low, too mournful. Then, as he pushed aside a tangle of branches, he saw it. There, against the gnarled roots of an old oak tree, was the source of the cry, a lynx cub. Its fur, spotted with the faint beginnings of the adult patterns it would one day have, was matted and damp. Its tiny body looked fragile, as if the slightest breeze might knock it over. It wasn't moving much, just trembling and letting out those faint cries that had led him here. The farmer crouched down, his breath visible in the cold air. "Poor thing," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The cub's ears twitched, but it didn't have the strength to move away. He reached out slowly, not wanting to scare the little animal. His hands were rough but warm as he carefully lifted the cub. It let out a weak sound, but it didn't resist. It was too exhausted, too cold, and perhaps too close to giving up. The man's mind raced. He had no idea how long the cub had been there or what had happened to its mother. Had she been hunted? Injured? Was she out there somewhere, desperately looking for her baby? The thought made his chest tighten, but he knew he couldn't leave the cub here. Not in this condition. It wouldn't last another night. As he cradled the tiny animal in his arms, he felt its heartbeat, weak but steady. He didn't know much about lynxes, but he knew enough about survival to understand that every second counted. Without food, warmth, or shelter, this little one wouldn't make it. Carrying the cub back to this farmhouse, the farmer couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. What was he doing? This wasn't a cat or a dog. It was a wild animal. But as the cub's fragile body pressed against him, its warmth seeping into his chest, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. It was as though fate had placed this little life in his hands, and now it was up to him to save it. The farmhouse came into view, its chimney puffing out thin streams of smoke. Inside, the man quickly cleared a space near the hearth, wrapping the cub in an old blanket. He placed it near the fire, hoping the warmth would bring it back from the brink of collapse. He poured some milk into a shallow dish and placed it nearby, unsure if the cub would even drink it. For a long while, the cub didn't move. The farmer watched anxiously, his own tea growing cold as the minutes ticked by. Then finally, a small flicker of movement. The cub stretched its tiny paw, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Slowly, hesitantly, it licked at the milk, each sip seeming to give it a little more strength. The farmer let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe, just maybe, this little one had a chance, but he also knew this was just the beginning. Taking in a Lynx cub wasn't like rescuing a stray puppy. This was going to be a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready for, but one he knew he couldn't walk away from. The first night was quiet, but the farmer barely slept. Every so often, he'd check on the cub, making sure it was still breathing, still warm. The little lynx curled itself into the blanket, its tiny body rising and falling with shallow breaths. It was alive, but the farmer knew survival was far from guaranteed. Morning came, and with it, the first set of challenges. The cub refused to eat anything other than a few sips of milk. It turned its head away from bits of softened bread or scraps of meat. The farmer frowned, unsure of what lynxes ate at this age. He'd spent his whole life tending to cows, chickens, and goats, not wild predators. But this was no ordinary situation, and ordinary solutions wouldn't work. He decided to visit his neighbor, an older woman named Greta, who was known in the village for her knowledge of animals. She raised hens and had once cared for an injured fox until it was well enough to return to the wild. If anyone could help, it would be her. When he arrived at her small cottage, carrying the lynx cub wrapped in the same blanket, Greta's eyes widened in disbelief. "You found this out there?" she asked, gently brushing her fingers over the cub's soft fur. He nodded. "Alone near the old oak. Looks like it hasn't eaten in days. I'm not sure what to do." Greta pursed her lips. "Milk is a start, but lynxes need meat, and lots of it. If this little one's going to make it, you'll have to feed it properly and keep it warm. They're not like house cats. They grow fast, and they need a lot of care." The farmer sighed. He'd expected it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it out loud made the weight of the task settle on his shoulders. Still, he wasn't going to give up. Greta handed him a small jar of goat milk and a few pieces of minced rabbit meat, explaining how to prepare it. "Be patient," she said. "It might take time, but it'll eat when it's ready." Back at the farmhouse, the lynx cub showed no interest in the food at first, but by evening, hunger won. It nibbled at the tiny pieces of meat, its sharp little teeth clicking against the bowl. The farmer felt a flicker of relief. It was eating. That was something. But the challenges didn't stop there. The other animals on the farm quickly noticed the new arrival. The hens clucked nervously whenever the farmer brought the cub outside, their feathers ruffling as they shuffled away. The goats were wary, their eyes watching the small predator with suspicion. Even the farmer's old dog, Buddy, seemed uneasy, his tail wagging slowly as he sniffed at the cub, unsure whether it was friend or foe. It was clear the lynx didn't belong here, not to the animals, and certainly not to the farm. Yet the cub began to adapt. It explored the farmhouse timidly, its small paws padding softly across the wooden floor. Occasionally, it would let out a soft moo, almost like it was calling for something or someone it had lost. The sound tugged at the farmer's heart. He couldn't replace its mother, but he could try to keep it safe. As the days turned into weeks, the cub grew stronger. Its appetite improved, and its energy returned. But with that energy came new challenges. The cub's natural instincts began to show. It pawed at the furniture, pounced at shadows, and tried to climb everything it could reach. The farmer found himself chasing it around the house more than once, shaking his head but smiling despite himself. Outside, the other animals still kept their distance. Buddy, the old dog, was the first to show signs of acceptance, occasionally sitting near the cub and even letting it curl up beside him on particularly cold nights. The goats, however, remained firmly unimpressed, bleating loudly whenever the lynx came too close. The farmer couldn't help but wonder, how long could this coexistence last? Could a wild animal truly live among domestic ones? Would the cub ever grow to a point where its instincts made it impossible to keep? But for now, he set those questions aside. The cub was alive, and that was what mattered. The bond between them was fragile, like a thread of trust stretched thin over the unknown, but it was growing stronger with each passing day. Little did the farmer know, this was just the beginning of the challenges and rewards that lay ahead. The lynx cub was thriving. Its once frail frame had filled out with lean muscle, and its coat had grown thicker and more vibrant. Its playful energy was boundless, and with each passing day, its wild instincts became more pronounced. But what surprised the farmer most wasn't the cub's recovery. It was the unexpected friendship that began to form with Buddy, his old, shaggy dog. At first, Buddy had kept his distance, warily observing the cub from across the room. The dog had seen plenty of animals come and go on the farm, but this one was different. There was something about the little lynx's quiet determination that seemed to intrigue him. Perhaps it was the cub's vulnerability or the way it followed the farmer around like a shadow. Whatever the reason, Buddy's cautious curiosity slowly turned into something more. The breakthrough came one cold evening when the farmer noticed the cub curled up against Buddy near the fireplace. It was the first time the lynx had sought out contact with another animal. Buddy didn't move, letting the cub nestle against his side. The sight brought a rare smile to the farmer's face. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. From that night on, the bond between Buddy and the lynx began to grow. It started with small gestures, the lynx batting playfully at Buddy's tail, the dog tolerating it with an almost fatherly patience. Then the cub began following Buddy around the farm, mimicking his every move. When Buddy barked at the goats to herd them, the cub would mimic the bark, though it came out as more of a chirping yowl. The farmer couldn't help but laugh at the absurd sight. What was even more remarkable was how Buddy seemed to take on the role of a mentor. The dog, despite his age, showed surprising bursts of energy when playing with the lynx. He'd nudge the cub gently when it strayed too far or growl softly when it got too rough. The lynx, in turn, became fiercely attached to Buddy, often refusing to settle unless the dog was nearby. The farmer watched their interactions with a mix of amusement and amazement. Here was a wild predator and a domesticated farm dog, two creatures who should have been natural enemies, yet they were inseparable. It was as if they understood each other in a way words could never express. But it wasn't just Buddy who played a role in the cub's development. The lynx's growing presence began to influence the other animals on the farm. The goats, who had initially been terrified, gradually grew more tolerant. They still kept their distance, but they no longer scattered in panic whenever the lynx wandered nearby. The chickens, ever cautious, stayed out of its reach, but didn't seem as nervous as before. The farmer noticed that the lynx seemed to understand these boundaries, almost as if it was learning the rules of the farm. The cub's personality began to shine through. It was playful but independent, affectionate, but still wild at heart. The farmer often found it perched on the windowsill, staring out at the woods as if drawn by some instinctive longing. It made him wonder, was he doing the right thing? Could this lynx ever truly belong here, or was he just delaying the inevitable? One day, as the farmer tended to his chores, he heard an unusual commotion coming from the barn. He rushed over to find the lynx standing its ground against a stray dog that had wandered onto the property. Its ears were flattened, its small body tense, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Buddy was by its side, barking fiercely to drive the intruder away. Together, they managed to chase the stray off the property. The farmer stood there stunned. The lynx was no longer the helpless cub he had found in the forest. It was growing into a strong, confident animal, and its bond with Buddy was unlike anything he had ever seen. That evening, as the farmer sat by the fire, watching Buddy and the lynx sleep side by side, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The bond between these two unlikely companions had not only given the lynx a second chance at life, but had also brought new energy to the old dog's twilight years. Still, a lingering question loomed in his mind. The lynx was growing fast, and its wild instincts were becoming harder to ignore. How long could this harmony last? For now, though, he chose to savor the moment. After all, life had a way of surprising him, and he had a feeling this story was far from over. The weeks turned into months, and the lynx cub was no longer the fragile creature the farmer had first found shivering under that oak tree. Its muscles had grown stronger, its coat thicker, and its instincts sharper. But with this growth came new challenges that began to test the delicate balance of their unusual family. The first sign of trouble came on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Dark clouds had been brewing on the horizon all morning, and by midday, a fierce storm swept through the farm. The wind howled, and the rain came down in relentless sheets. The animals were restless, their calls muffled by the thunder. The lynx paced near the window, its sharp eyes following the flashes of lightning. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the barn. The farmer grabbed his coat and ran outside, Buddy at his heels. When they reached the barn, they saw the problem. A large tree limb had fallen, smashing through part of the roof. Rain poured inside, and the goats were huddled in a corner, bleeding in panic. The chickens flapped wildly, their feathers soaked as they scrambled for cover. The lynx, still hesitant around the larger animals, hung back near the barn's entrance, watching the chaos unfold. But something shifted in that moment. When one of the smaller goats got separated from the herd and became trapped near the fallen limb, the lynx sprang into action. Its movements were quick and calculated, its small frame weaving through the debris. It nudged the frightened goat gently, guiding it back to the others. The farmer couldn't believe his eyes. This was the same creature that had once been too weak to stand, now showing courage and instinct beyond its years. He worked quickly to repair the barn's roof as best as he could, all the while glancing back at the lynx, who seemed to have taken on a new role in the farm's ecosystem. But the storm wasn't the only challenge they faced. A more dangerous threat lurked just beyond the safety of the farm. One evening, as the farmer was preparing for bed, Buddy began barking furiously at the door. The farmer grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his heart racing. In the distance, he saw movement, shadowy figures near the edge of the woods. Poachers. They had been a problem in the area for years, targeting wildlife for illegal trade. The farmer's blood ran cold. If they had spotted the lynx, they wouldn't hesitate to take it. He rushed to the barn, where the lynx was curled up in its usual spot. Its ears perked up as he approached, sensing his urgency. That night, the farmer decided he couldn't take any chances. He reinforced the barn door and kept the lynx inside the house, much to its annoyance. It pawed at the door and let out frustrated chirps, its wild instincts yearning for the freedom of the outdoors. The poachers returned a few nights later. This time, they were closer. Buddy's barking woke the farmer again, and he stepped outside to find two men near the chicken coop, scanning the area with flashlights. They hadn't reached the barn yet, but it was only a matter of time. The farmer didn't have much to defend himself, but he grabbed an old shotgun, a relic passed down from his father, and fired a warning shot into the air. The poachers scattered, disappearing into the woods, but the farmer knew they'd be back. They had seen something that intrigued them, and they wouldn't give up easily. The lynx's bond with Buddy became even more crucial during these tense times. The dog seemed to understand the danger and rarely left the lynx's side, even patrolling the perimeter of the house at night. The farmer began to wonder if the lynx's presence on the farm was putting everyone at risk. Could he truly protect it from the dangers of both the wild and the human world? The storm and the poachers had shaken the fragile peace of their lives, but they had also revealed something important. The lynx was no longer just a helpless animal. It had become a part of the farm, a part of the family. Its bond with Buddy and the farmer was undeniable, and its presence brought a sense of unity to everyone on the farm, even the other animals. Still, the farmer couldn't ignore the growing tension. The lynx was getting bigger, its instincts sharper. It was a wild animal at heart, and its place in this world was becoming harder to define. The question lingered in his mind like a shadow. Was he keeping the lynx safe, or was he holding it back from the life it was meant to live? The tension on the farm had become almost unbearable. The poachers hadn't returned yet, but their presence hung over the farmer like a dark cloud. The lynx, now almost fully grown, was restless. It spent hours pacing by the windows or sitting at the edge of the barn, staring out into the woods as if it could sense something beyond the trees. Then, one evening, the breaking point arrived. The farmer was out tending to a late chore near the goat pen when Buddy's barking shattered the quiet. This wasn't his usual bark. It was sharp and frantic, the sound of an animal calling for help. The farmer dropped everything and sprinted toward the house, his heart pounding. As he rounded the corner, he froze. Two figures were standing near the barn, their flashlights sweeping over the building. It was the poachers. They were back, and this time, they weren't just scouting. One of them held a large cage, while the other carried a tranquilizer rifle. Before the farmer could react, the lynx let out a guttural growl and leaped from the shadows, its body a blur of motion. It landed just feet from the men, its fur bristling, its sharp teeth bared. The poachers stumbled back in shock, one of them dropping the rifle. Buddy was there too, barking furiously as he circled the men, keeping them off balance. The lynx and the dog worked together, instinctively defending their home and each other. The poachers, clearly unprepared for this level of resistance, turned and ran, abandoning the cage and rifle in their panic. The farmer rushed to the lynx, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The animal was unharmed but visibly agitated, pacing and growling softly as it watched the poachers disappear into the woods. Buddy stood close by, his tail wagging slightly, but his eyes still locked on the trees. The farmer knelt down, his hand shaking as he gently stroked the lynx's head. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He glanced at Buddy, who gave a low, approving bark. For the first time, the farmer truly understood the depth of the bond these two animals shared. They weren't just companions, they were a team, united by a shared sense of loyalty and protection. But the events of that night also forced the farmer to confront a painful truth. The lynx had grown into a powerful, wild predator. Its instincts, as much as it had adapted to life on the farm, were calling it back to the wilderness. The farmer couldn't ignore the way it stared out at the woods, its body tense, its ears twitching at every distant sound. The next morning, the farmer made a decision. He couldn't keep the lynx confined any longer. It had proven itself capable of surviving on its own, and it deserved the freedom it was born for. But letting go was easier said than done. He spent the day preparing, packing a small bag with supplies he thought might help the lynx adjust to life in the wild: scraps of meat, a thick blanket for shelter, and a small collar with his name and number, just in case. Buddy stayed close to the lynx all day, as if sensing what was coming. As the sun began to set, the farmer led the lynx to the edge of the woods. His heart felt heavy, but he knew this was the right thing to do. He knelt down, his hand resting on the lynx's strong, muscular shoulder. "You'll be okay out there," he said softly. "You're strong, you're smart, and you'll always have a place here if you need it." The lynx nuzzled his hand for a moment, a rare show of affection that brought tears to the farmer's eyes. Then, with one last look, it turned and disappeared into the trees, its sleek form vanishing into the shadows. Buddy let out a soft whine, his tail drooping as he watched his friend leave. The farmer placed a reassuring hand on the dog's head. "We did the best we could," he said, though the words felt hollow. As they walked back to the farmhouse, the farmer couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. But he also felt something else, a quiet pride. The lynx had come so far, and though it was leaving, its story would always be a part of their lives. The days after the lynx release were quiet, almost too quiet. The farmhouse, once bustling with the energy of the mischievous cub, now felt emptier. Buddy, usually the heart of the farm, seemed to share in the farmer's melancholy. He spent his days near the edge of the woods, occasionally sniffing the air as if searching for a familiar scent. The farmer threw himself into his daily routines, but his thoughts often drifted to the lynx. Was it safe? Had it found a place to belong? He had done everything he could to prepare it for the wild, but the worry lingered. Every distant rustle of leaves or snap of a branch would make him pause, his heart hopeful yet heavy. Then, one morning, something remarkable happened. The farmer was out collecting firewood near the forest's edge when Buddy suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. He barked once, sharply, and took off toward the trees. The farmer called after him, but the dog was determined, his nose to the ground. Following Buddy, the farmer entered the woods, his boots crunching softly against the underbrush. It didn't take long before he saw it. A flash of movement, sleek and silent, darting between the trees. His breath caught in his throat as the lynx emerged from the shadows, its coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. The lynx was no longer the vulnerable cub he had rescued. It stood tall and confident, its muscles rippling with every movement, but there was something in its eyes, a recognition, a spark of the bond they had shared. Buddy barked excitedly and bounded toward the lynx, who responded with a soft, almost playful chirp. The two animals circled each other, their movements fluid and familiar. The farmer stood frozen, overcome with emotion as he watched the reunion. It was as if the lynx had returned to say, "I'm okay. I haven't forgotten you." The lynx stayed for a while, following Buddy and the farmer back to the clearing near the house. It didn't enter the farmhouse or the barn but lingered at the edge, watching as if soaking in the sights and sounds of the place it had once called home. The farmer offered a small piece of meat, which it accepted cautiously, its movements both graceful and wild. As the sun began to set, the lynx stood and stretched, its tail swishing in the cool evening air. With a final glance at the farmer and Buddy, it turned and slipped back into the forest, its silhouette fading into the shadows. The farmer watched until it was completely gone, his heart heavy but full of a quiet sense of peace. He knew the lynx would never truly belong to him or the farm. It was a creature of the wild, meant to roam free. But knowing it had found the strength to survive, and that it hadn't forgotten the life they had shared, was enough. That night, as the farmer sat by the fire with Buddy at his feet, he reflected on everything the lynx had taught him. It had come into his life unexpectedly, challenging him, frustrating him, and ultimately inspiring him. The bond they had formed was unlike anything he had ever experienced, proof that even the most unlikely connections could leave lasting marks. Though the lynx was gone, its presence lingered in the farmer's heart, and as Buddy dozed by the fire, his tail twitching in dreams, the farmer smiled to himself. He knew the lynx would always be a part of their story, a reminder that sometimes the greatest bonds are the ones that change us forever. The story of the farmer and the lynx is a powerful reminder that bonds can form in the most unexpected places. Whether it's between a man and a wild animal, or even two creatures as different as a lynx and a farm dog, these connections have the power to transform lives. But stories like this also highlight the importance of protecting wildlife and respecting the delicate balance between humans and nature. The farmer didn't just save a life. He gave the lynx a chance to thrive and reminded us all of the impact one act of kindness can have. If this story touched your heart, consider supporting wildlife conservation efforts in your area. Whether it's volunteering, donating, or simply spreading awareness, every little action helps ensure that creatures like the lynx have the freedom and space they deserve. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible journey. What part of the story moved you the most? Do you believe wild animals can truly bond with humans? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one and can't